Imagine you are about to make a really high-stakes deal. There is a massive amount of money on the line, goods are totally ready to change hands, but there's a catch.
Always a catch.
Right. There are no cops, there are no courts, there is absolutely no state authority anywhere to enforce the rules of this transaction. So, what happens next? Do we just instantly descend into chaos and theft?
Well, we have this deeply ingrained belief that without the looming threat of a judge's gavel, society just unravels. I mean, we assume we need the law to keep us honest, especially when there is serious value at stake.
But history and economics and even modern technology suggest something entirely different. So in this deep dive, we're exploring the fascinating concept of order without law.
Yeah, and we have a massive, incredibly diverse stack of material we are synthesizing for you today.
We really do. We are pulling from anthropological studies of 11th century Mediterranean traders, field research on modern California cattle ranchers, some dense economic frameworks on global market infrastructure, all the way to the technical documentation for cutting-edge crypto wallets.
It is a wide spectrum, for sure.
Yeah.
But every single one of these examples points to the exact same phenomenon. Humans do not inherently need a state to govern their trades. We build our own governance.
Exactly. And the mission for you, the listener, is simple. We want to provide you with a shortcut to understanding the invisible rules that really govern our world.
Because formal law is often far less important than you might think.
Right. We're going to show you exactly how humans invent trust completely out of thin air. And let's start right there with the myth of the courtroom. And to do that, we are heading to rural California, specifically Shasta County.
Yeah, so legal scholar Robert Ellickson went there to study a classic legal hypothetical, the conflict between farmers and ranchers.
The ultimate rural turf war.
Exactly. Now, Shasta County is essentially a patchwork of two distinct legal zones. You have open range, where farmers are legally required to build fences to keep cattle out if they want to protect your crops.
Okay.
And right next to it, you have closed range, where the ranchers are legally required to fence their cattle in.
So it is the perfect natural experiment. You have two completely different sets of legal rules right next to each other.
Right.
According to traditional legal theory, you would expect the behavior of the ranchers and the farmers to drastically change depending on which side of that invisible legal boundary they are standing on.
You'd expect negotiations, threats of lawsuits, maybe cash settlements shifting based on who the law holds liable for a trespassing cow.
But that's not what happens, is it?
Not even close. Ellickson found that the actual law had zero effect on how neighbors handled these trespassing cattle.
Wait, really? Zero effect?
None whatsoever. I mean, they didn't care about open or closed range. They didn't even know the specifics of the statutes. Instead, they relied entirely on a private system of self-enforcing norms.
Meaning the informal rules of the community. Like, if a rancher's cow wanders onto a farmer's property and eats a bunch of crops, the rancher doesn't get a letter from a lawyer.
No summons, no lawsuits.
Instead, the rancher is expected to apologize, go retrieve the cow, and make some kind of non-monetary restitution.
And that word non-monetary is the critical mechanism here. They do not write a check for the damaged crops.
Because that's too formal.
Well, handing over cold, hard cash feels too transactional. It introduces a market dynamic into what is supposed to be a neighborly relationship.
Ah, I see.
So instead, the rancher might come over the next weekend and help the farmer replant the ruined tomatoes or lend them some equipment. Helping replant the tomatoes signals solidarity. It communicates that they are in this together, sharing the risks of the rural environment.
That is so interesting, and the system is remarkably effective without any police involvement. Because it's enforced by gossip, right?
Exactly. Gossip is the enforcer. If a rancher consistently lets their cows stray, the community talks, and their reputation tanks. People just stop helping them out.
And if they really refuse to cooperate, the victim might escalate to driving the stray herd miles away, which forces the irresponsible rancher to spend days tracking them down. The absolute last thing they do, the ultimate taboo, is taking a neighbor to court.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that punishment method seems completely irrational to me.
How so?
Well, if a cow keeps destroying my garden, driving the herd miles away is incredibly inefficient. It costs me a ton of time and physical effort to move them, and it costs the rancher a massive amount of time to find them.
Right.
Why wouldn't I just slaughter the stray cow and put it in my freezer? I mean, that punishes the rancher by depriving them of their property, and it perfectly reimburses me for my lost tomatoes. Is this massive inefficiency deliberate?
It is entirely deliberate, and it is actually a brilliant evolutionary feature of informal norms. Think about it. If you get to keep the cow, You actually benefit from the
Oh,
punishment.
which makes me a biased judge in my own case. Precisely. If the punishment is profitable for the victim, well, the victim has an incentive to exaggerate the crime, or even orchestrate it, maybe by leaving a gate open on purpose just to trap a cow.
Wow, yeah. I now have a financial incentive to find your cows on my land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the rancher knows this, feels cheated by the lost cow, and retaliates. And suddenly you have a blood feud on your hands.
Right.
So, by using a punishment that is costly to both parties, like driving the herd away, it proves to the community and to the offending rancher that the victim isn't trying to profit. They're simply trying to stop the bad behavior. That shared cost prevents the dispute from escalating into a cycle of retribution.
That is wild. And, this isn't just a quirk of modern California cowboys. We see this exact same dynamic operating 1,000 years ago.
Oh yeah, the Maghribi traders.
Right. Avner Grief's research on the Maghribi traders in the 11th century maps perfectly to this. These were Jewish merchants operating across the Mediterranean, trusting overseas agents with massive amounts of wealth and cargo.
And you'd think a high-stakes, long-distance trade network like that would require a heavy legal framework to prevent theft.
But less than 1% of their surviving documents involved any legal activity for trade. Less than 1%.
Because they utilized a multilateral reputation mechanism instead of relying on local rulers or courts. It was basically a giant gossip network.
Right, like if an agent cheated a merchant in Genoa, the merchant would write letters to the rest of the coalition. Word spread rapidly through their communication networks, and suddenly no Maghribi trader in Alexandria, Jerusalem, or anywhere else would ever do business with that agent again.
The threat of total commercial exile, just losing your entire livelihood permanently, was far more terrifying and effective than any local court order could ever be.
So if gossip, reputation, and replanting tomatoes work so beautifully to maintain order, why do we even have a legal system? Why do we ever walk into a courtroom?
Well, because informal norms have a breaking point. They are incredibly powerful, but they are fragile. They only function within specific parameters.
So they fail eventually.
Yeah, they fail when the group gets too big, when the stakes change drastically,
Yeah.
or, and this is the big one, when strangers enter the picture.
Which brings us to the limits of norms. Back in Shasta County, the ranchers completely ignore the law when it comes to fences and trespassing cows between neighbors. But they do care deeply about the law when it comes to highway accidents involving their cattle.
Oh, they lobby local government aggressively over it.
But here's the bizarre part. The ranchers are totally wrong about what the law actually says regarding highway collisions.
Yeah, they hold this collective false belief. They think that in an open range, a random motorist who hits a cow is strictly liable. The local saying is, the motorist buys the cow.
Right.
And they believe that in a closed range, the rancher is strictly liable. The rancher buys the car.
But legally, that's just not true. It is essentially a standard negligence test either way. You have to prove who is actually at fault. But even though their belief in the law is entirely incorrect, their behavior based on that false belief is economically rational.
Right. Because of this false belief regarding strict liability, the ranchers who let their cattle roam freely during the summer completely avoid grazing them in closed-range areas near highways.
They want to avoid the massive financial risk of having to buy the car if a family in a minivan hits their cow.
Exactly. And the reason they can avoid this perceived risk so easily is that they lease their grazing land from the federal government, specifically the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service.
And those agencies use uniform pricing.
Right. The lease costs the exact same per acre everywhere, regardless of whether it is an open or closed range.
So they avoid a perceived catastrophic risk because it costs them absolutely nothing to do so. But this highway accident issue highlights a fundamental shift. When it's a random motorist passing through a stranger, the neighborly norm of replanting tomatoes doesn't apply.
You can't exactly gossip about a tourist from 3 states away.
Exactly, you need the law. And we see this breaking point historically, too, with 19th century whalers.
The whalers are a great example. They successfully created incredibly efficient informal norms to determine who owned a whale if, say, one ship harpooned it and another ship eventually dragged it in.
The rules varied depending on the species of whale and how aggressively it behaved, but overall the community respected these ownership norms perfectly out on the open ocean.
But they entirely failed to create any norms for conservation.
They hunted species to the brink of extinction because informal norms just couldn't handle the scale of the problem.
Right, because a norm for conservation only works if absolutely everyone follows it. If you nobly agree to spare a whale to protect the breeding population, but the rival ship 5 miles behind you just kills it anyway, you have sacrificed your profit for zero collected benefit.
The closed loop of accountability breaks down completely. Here's where it gets really interesting. Norms are basically a small-town honor system. It works beautifully when everyone knows everyone, and you all have to look each other in the eye at the local grocery store.
Mm.
But as soon as a stranger passes through town, or you face a massive global crisis like whale conservation, that handshake deal instantly collapses. And we see this transition vividly in the London marine insurance market in the 15th and 16th centuries.
Right, it started as a club of insiders. Merchants using the customary law merchant to resolve disputes internally, all based on good faith and reputation.
Because the London insiders had that closed loop of consequences.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they had that closed loop, and in the 1570s, the market expanded rapidly. Suddenly you had outsiders entering the market.
People who weren't in the club.
Exactly. These are individuals who did not care about the club's reputation. They were purely focused on maximizing short-term profit, even if it meant defrauding the system and just disappearing.
So the honor system broke down because anonymity was introduced.
Yes.
The insiders couldn't rely on gossip to punish an outsider who didn't care about their social standing, so they had to beg the state for help. They created a centralized registration office and eventually the 1601 Court of Assurances.
They literally had to invent formal, state-backed legal institutions to deal with the arrival of strangers. Because once anonymity enters the equation, a community can no longer police itself through social pressure. An external enforcer is required to give teeth to a contract.
And that outsider problem from 16th century London, that is the exact same problem we face today on the largest possible scale, the modern global market.
It is. The global market is the ultimate anonymous space. When a manufacturing company in Germany buys microchips from a supplier in China, there is no world state to oversee that transaction.
There is no global police force that can kick down a door if the microchips turn out to be defective.
Right. It creates a massive, high-stakes prisoner's dilemma for cross-border trade. Without a global court, whoever moves first risks losing everything.
Because if the German company sends the money first, the Chinese supplier might not ship the goods.
And if the supplier ships the goods first, the German company might just refuse to pay.
So how do they deal with it?
Well, transaction cost economics, or TCE, explains how the market attempts to solve this lawlessness. TCE focuses heavily on what's called the make-or-buy decision.
Make or buy.
Yeah. In a perfect world, with perfect global laws and absolute trust, companies would always choose to buy. They would purchase what they need on the open market from independent suppliers because the open market is competitive, efficient, and cheap.
But because international commercial law is so incredibly deficient, because that overarching world state doesn't exist to enforce the contract, companies simply don't trust the open market. The risk of being cheated by an anonymous overseas supplier is just too high.
So instead of buying, they choose to make. They move away from cheap, arm's-length market transactions and rely on the internal structure of the firm.
Which drives massive vertical integration globally. Companies don't just buy materials, they buy up their entire supply chains and absorb them into one giant, sprawling corporate empire.
Exactly. Vertical integration is fundamentally an adaptation to lawlessness. If you cannot trust an external supplier because there is no court to protect you, you bring that supplier inside the boundaries of your own corporation.
Because once they are an employee rather than an external contractor, you can enforce the rules through corporate hierarchy and internal auditing.
Bypassing the need for a legal system entirely.
But they can't make everything, right? When these massive corporations absolutely have to deal with outside entities across borders, they use international arbitration.
Which is essentially a private shadow justice system designed to simulate the safety of state law.
And thanks to a treaty called the 1958 New York Convention, domestic courts around the world are legally obligated to enforce these private arbitral awards without retrying the case from scratch.
Right, arbitration serves a purpose, but it carries severe structural downsides. First, it heavily favors the wealthy. Elite international arbitrators charge upwards of €350 an hour, and the proceedings are incredibly complex.
So small or medium-sized businesses simply cannot afford to access this tier of private justice.
Exactly. And second, these elite arbitrators are paid directly by the private parties involved in the dispute, which means The arbitrators have zero incentive to protect the broader public good.
Like, if two massive international corporations are using arbitration to settle a contract dispute, the private arbitrator isn't going to raise a red flag and say, wait a minute, this contract is actually an illegal cartel agreement that violates global antitrust laws.
No, of course not.
Mm.
They are hired to resolve the dispute between the two parties, not to police the market. They just rubber stamp the deal.
So what does this all mean? Are we, the everyday consumers, essentially paying a hidden lawlessness tax on everything we buy?
Well, yeah.
Because to survive in this global market, companies have to build these massive, bloated, vertically integrated empires and hire elite €350 an hour private judges just to guarantee a basic supply chain deal won't fall through.
Transaction cost economics argues exactly that. Vertical integration is considered the organizational form of last resort. I mean, it creates massive administrative bloat, requires layers of middle management, and it destroys natural competitive market incentives.
But they do it anyway.
Because the global physical market lacks a reliable, unified legal system. The economy is forced into this highly inefficient structure, and the consumer ultimately absorbs the cost of that inefficiency.
Okay, so if the physical global market has to rely on bloated corporate empires and wildly expensive private judges just to survive without a global state, what on earth happens in the digital realm?
Now that is the frontier.
What happens when buyers and sellers aren't just international, but truly anonymous, where you don't even know the legal name, the country, or the physical location of the entity you are trading with?
This is where the architecture of Web3 and blockchain completely rewrites the rules. In the digital realm, the solution to the outsider problem isn't replacing the state with a bloated corporation. It is replacing the state with mathematics and code.
Enter Safe, formerly known as Gnosis Safe. This is a smart contract wallet. It replaces the standard single-user crypto account with a programmable multi-signature setup.
Right, you can require multiple independent parties to mathematically sign off before a transaction is approved.
Today, SAFE secures tens of billions of dollars for decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, and massive on-chain businesses. But hold on, if I have a decentralized organization with dozens of members and complex voting logic, how does deploying all of that code not instantly bankrupt them?
The gas fees, right?
Yeah. Executing heavy logic on a blockchain like Ethereum is notoriously expensive.
And that is the brilliance of its architecture. SAFE utilizes what's called a singleton plus proxy pattern to solve the cost issue.
Okay, how does that work?
You do not deploy the massive, complex core code every time a new user wants a wallet. The heavy logic lives in just one single place on the blockchain, the singleton.
Oh, I see.
When you or a DAO create a new SAFE, you are just deploying a tiny, lightweight proxy contract. That proxy holds your specific funds, but it just points to the singleton for its operating instructions. It makes institutional-grade security economically viable for anyone operating for pennies.
But what about governance? In a vertically integrated corporation, a rogue employee can be fired or sued. In a DAO, where everyone is anonymous, what stops someone with partial access from just draining the shared treasury the second they get a chance?
That is where SAFE uses what they call modules and guards. These are programmable constraints that automate the informal norms we discussed earlier, but they mathematically guarantee them.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Allowance modules allow a DAO to delegate a specific capped amount of money to an individual to spend on daily operations. They never get the master keys to the whole treasury, just a mathematically enforced budget.
And there are delay modules, right? Like the ones built by Zodiac. They create mandatory time locks.
Yes, exactly. If a DAO vote passes to move a massive amount of funds, the delay module forces a waiting period, say 48 hours, before the transaction can actually execute on the blockchain.
Which gives the community a crucial window to react, verify, or halt the transaction if the vote was somehow contested or malicious.
And guards go even a step further. They run automated pre-checks and post-checks on every single transaction to enforce strict corporate policies without needing a compliance department. You can mathematically ensure that funds only go to specific, pre-approved, whitelisted addresses.
But let's talk about the user experience, because crypto is notoriously clunky. If I'm interacting with these complex modules, don't I have to constantly hold the native network token just to pay the gas fees every time I click a button? Doesn't that friction ruin the dream of seamless global commerce?
It used to, yeah. Which is why the SAFE 4337 module is such a breakthrough. It introduces something called account abstraction.
Account abstraction.
Right. Historically, the account initiating the transaction and the account paying the gas fee had to be the exact same entity. Account abstraction decouples them. It allows for gas-sponsored transactions.
Meaning a DAO or a business can act as a paymaster. They can cover the gas fees on behalf of their users behind the scenes.
It's exactly like using a traditional web app today. When you use a cloud-based service, the company pays the Amazon Web Services server bill, not you. Account abstraction makes the blockchain invisible to the end user.
So, looking at the big picture here, an international arbitrator in a tailored suit costs €350 an hour to review a contract, rely on a 1958 treaty, and hope the domestic court enforces their decision.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, a guard, or an allowance module, in a safe wallet is doing the exact same job of enforcing a contract between anonymous strangers. But it's doing it for pennies, it executes instantly, and it literally cannot be bribed, ignored, or appealed. It is like replacing the entire 16th century London Court of Assurances with an unbreakable, mathematically perfect vending machine.
What's fascinating here is how smart contracts fundamentally solve the outsider problem that has plagued global commerce for centuries. You do not need to know or trust the other party, like the Maghribi traders did.
Right.
You do not need to beg a state court for intervention, like the London insurers did. And you do not need to build a vertically integrated corporate monopoly to control your supply chain. The code itself becomes the unbending, universally applied law.
It really brings this whole journey full circle. We have seen that human beings throughout history will always find a way to trade, collaborate, and build.
We adapt our institutions to our environment, regardless of whether a formal government is looking over our shoulder.
Exactly. The drive to exchange value is fundamental to who we are. If the environment lacks trust, we simply engineer it.
We build it from scratch.
Whether it is Shasta County ranchers offering to replant a patch of ruined tomatoes to preserve a neighborhood, 16th century London insurers begging the state to set up a court to handle strangers, modern multinational corporations buying up their supply chains to avoid the risk of lawlessness, or decentralized autonomous organizations locking billions of dollars inside smart contract wallets guarded by cryptography. We are constantly, relentlessly inventing order without law. We build trust where none exists.
And this raises an important question for you to consider moving forward. We have seen how much effort humanity has expended over the centuries trying to simulate the safety of the state.
So much effort.
So if blockchain code and cryptography can finally provide the cheap, frictionless, and completely unbiased contract enforcement that the global market has been desperately searching for since the 11th century, will the traditional nation-state legal system eventually become the inefficient alternative?
Wow.
Will state courts and highly paid lawyers eventually become the clunky, outdated backup plan that we only bother to use when our smart contracts fail?
Think about that the next time you picture that high-stakes deal with no cops and no courts. It might not be a recipe for chaos after all. It might just be a glimpse into the future of trust.